All right, so has everybody gotten back to normal after last week? So we are now on Module 12, and like I mentioned during the immersive week, now we're kind of switching gears here, and we're going to be looking at counseling techniques and theories specific to different categories of or populations of individuals. And so this week we're looking at counseling individuals with physical disabilities. If I know there were a number of articles that I posted on the module this week. By no means do I mean for you to read all of them. However, if you are going to read one or pick one, the one that I really do want everybody to read is the Application of Personality Theories and Counseling Strategies to Clients with Physical Disabilities article. It is very comprehensive, and it goes through a number of different of the personality theories, the theories that we kind of touched on last week or 2 weeks ago. Whenever you're watching this, it might have been 2 weeks ago. But so I would like you all to read that one. So consider that kind of the chapter reading for this week. So when we're thinking about the more common types of physical disabilities, so kind of moving into slide 2 here, I just wanted to provide some of the basic list, if you will. So an individual with a physical disability can have any kind of physical limitation, and that can be a result of any number of things. It could be that somebody simply is using a mobility aid for one reason or another. Maybe they have had a physical limitation since birth and have always used a mobility aid or a wheelchair. Maybe there was a sudden onset of disability or an injury or an illness that has now required them to use a wheelchair or mobility aid. Muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, all of these can be conditions that result in somebody needing to use a wheelchair or some type of mobility aid. It can be, or they're just kind of categorized in that physical disability category, right? Somebody could have limitations in walking or standing. So any of that can fall under these categories. And so when you're thinking of a physical disability, it can span kind of across or through those traditional lines, if you will, of what we think is a physical disability, something that's visible. If we're thinking about diabetes as a physical disability, it's diabetes impacts, how certain systems in the body function and can result in physical limitations like walking or vision limitations even. Chronic pain is something that we can't see necessarily, but within the mental health counseling world, lots and lots and lots of individuals and clients have chronic pain or fibromyalgia, for example, conditions that we can't see and that can be a little bit more difficult to diagnose and treat and manage. So the reality is that even if you're not working in a traditional rehabilitation counseling setting, it is very, very likely that you're going to have clients on your caseload that have a physical disability. It may not be the initial reason why they're coming to you for counseling, but it certainly can play a role in their overall mental health and well-being. So there's not really there aren't really any theories that couldn't be used when you're working with someone with a physical disability. But if we're thinking about issues that individuals with physical disabilities may have or things they might be presenting as a goal that they might want to work on in counseling, addressing adjustment is a big one. And especially so for individuals that have an onset of a disability or physical impairment, later on in life or at some point in life, those that aren't born with a disability. So when it comes to theory, in the one article that I referenced does talk about somatopsychology and how that really focuses on adjustment to disability and how counselors facilitate a client's acceptance and movement towards adjusting to the disability. Motivational interviewing, there's been some literature on the use of motivational interviewing techniques for individuals with chronic pain. I don't think I posted any of those on the site, but certainly they're out there, so that can be useful too. Again, really with both of these, we are focusing on somebody's strengths, their abilities. We're motivating them to, pursue things that they want to be pursuing, and to really just kind of reframe the way that they are perceiving themselves in an effort to help facilitate adjustment. When we're thinking about addressing negative patterns of thought or irrational thoughts, CBT, REBT are two theoretical orientations that can help individuals, again, start being able to recognize those patterns of thought, and then reframe them, or reshape how they think of themselves. If we're looking at the traditional vocational counseling and counseling individuals with physical disabilities, using that solution focused or brief therapy approaches can be very useful, because it might be that you have a limited amount of time to provide the actual traditional type of counseling to individuals within the VR counseling realm, and also using positive psychology. And positive psychology really can span through addressing adjustment issues as well as patterns of thought. But again, focusing on somebody's strengths and their strength-based characteristics, right? So to get a little bit deeper into adjusting to disability, and using the somatopsychology framework, Beatrice Wright basically developed this model of adjusting to disability back in the 70s, I believe. She was one of a couple, and the article does talk about other individuals that kind of spearheaded this movement. But Beatrice Wright is just a good name to remember. So really, the model emphasizes coping, and the term coping, versus succumbing, quote unquote, succumbing to disability, and a framework around helping facilitate that adjustment to disability, and helping a client move through the coping process. There's a focus on positive aspects, what somebody is able to do, their qualities, and she suggested this requirement of mourning that those that are able-bodied have, where people that don't have a disability or are able-bodied wrongfully believe that every person with a disability has to go through this period of mourning the loss of their abilities, which is not always the case. Sure, yes, some individuals do go through the process of mourning, a loss of function or onset of disability at some point in their lives, but not all do. And what we might think of as a mourning process might not look the same for every individual. So I always encourage students to not automatically assume that an individual coming into their office that has a physical disability, somebody that's using a mobility aid, maybe somebody that has had a traumatic event happen in their lives that's resulted in some limitations, don't always assume that that individual has been or needs to be mourning the loss of function. It may be that they have gone through that on their own and they're ready to move on to the next step of adjustment. But that can be an area of bias for us to assume that all of our clients have to mourn the loss of function. So coping, again, what is coping? How do we know if somebody has adequately coped with the onset of a disability? So really, it happens whenever we have put a focus on what a person can do, what their abilities are. We're looking at what areas of life a person can participate, looking at what they're still able to do. Do they have the same friend group? Do they have the same social supports, the same social network? Are they able to participate in school, and emphasizing what somebody is still able to do rather than what they're not able to do any longer. The individual is always seen as an active participant in the process, not as a victim. And again, that's an area where we can start to address our own personal biases and some stereotypes that exist, that any individual that has a physical disability is a victim of something in some way. So individuals with physical disabilities are participating in the process with us. They're driving it. And a lot of times that can even be reemphasized in the terminology that we use. If you think of counseling and psychotherapy in the past, the client was a patient, right? And that kind of, there's negative connotations around that term patient. And now we are seeing that clients aren't even being referred to as clients, but rather consumers. So they're there to seek a product or a service from us, essentially. And so that's, putting somebody on the same level, if not, being seen as the primary participant, as they should be. So we're not, the individual's not working toward a cure, and they're understanding that they're not working toward a cure, quote unquote, if they've kind of gone through this coping process and are adjusting to disability, the physical disability. The disability is a personal characteristic, just like I have brown hair or I wear glasses. The disability is part of that person's whole being, and we're moving away from denial that there is a disability or that there are limitations, but again, rather acceptance of who that individual is as a whole. And reinforcing that negative aspects are still manageable. It may be that we're focusing on, if we're going back to things that a person can do and ways they can participate in various parts of their lives that may not be that they're doing it in the exact same way that they used to be doing it, but there's still an ability to manage those limitations, to address the barriers that exist, and to continue to thrive. Okay, so I think I already went over most of everything on slide 6 here without even knowing it. So adjustment happens when a person focuses on things other than their disability. Whenever a person is limiting the importance of physical appearance and ability. With this, we often, in the past again, we kind of overuse that term normal, people getting back to normal or people looking normal, right? And I always question what in the world is normal. I for sure don't believe that any part of my life is normal. And so that also spans over into physical appearance and ability. If we're thinking about who looks normal, there's societal perceptions and views of what normal is, but we can help reframe our clients' understanding of how they look, what their physical appearance is, and their abilities are. And finally, and I'm going to try to do this with each one of the next modules that we go through, but I do want to put some emphasis on accessibility and how that can play into working with clients with disabilities in general. And I believe I mentioned this in class at some point, but if you look at the research on the utilization of mental health counseling services and even vocational counseling services by individuals that have a disability, those individuals are largely underserved in the mental health counseling realm, in addition to the medical realm too. And a lot of that has to do with accessibility. So these are questions you can ask yourself. If you're working in an agency, if you're opening up your own private practice, these are things to be mindful of so that you are making yourself available and accessible to individuals that have physical disabilities. One, transportation. Can the client get to your appointment? Are you working somewhere rural? Do they have a bus system? If not, and the individual uses a mobility aid, do they have their own vehicle? Do they need to rely on somebody else for transportation? Do you need to make some modifications in your schedule to accommodate that person? So be aware that transportation can be a serious and significant barrier to accessing mental health counseling services for people with physical disabilities. If they can't get to the appointment, can they get in the building? Is your building accessible? If not, what are some ways that you can make the facility accessible, even if it's going beyond what maybe the general ADA requirements are for that building? I know there was a facility here in town that I was thinking about working at, and it was completely inaccessible. And so one of the ways around that I proposed to the owner of the agency was to open myself up to doing telecounseling, so that I could still engage with individuals that weren't able to access the facility that were looking for counseling services. So, physical access is a big one. And if they can get in the building, can they get to your office? Are you on, are you in the basement and there's an elevator there, but it doesn't go to the basement? basement. Hopefully nobody's really stuck in the basement, but you, I hope, understand what I'm saying here. So is your office accessible? And even within the office, do you have a ton of furniture? Do you have like a shag carpet that it would be difficult for somebody that uses a wheelchair to maneuver in? Do you have like a huge couch and a chair, and like there's just not enough space? So these are things to be mindful of whenever you're out there practicing. As far as documentation goes, and thinking here about individuals that have upper extremity limitations, maybe they are able to write, maybe they need an alternative format to fill out forms. Maybe forms could be provided, or that documentation can be provided prior to that initial session. I know sometimes counseling agencies will go ahead and send out that information prior to that initial session. One, to speed up the process. If you have a client coming in or a consumer coming in that's already completed all the paperwork, it can speed up that initial session. Complete that intake interview information earlier on. But it can also be really beneficial for individuals that use some type of assistive technology to access their computer. If they have that type of technology at home and they're able to do it independently prior to the session, then that should be an option that's made available. Or if you're completing the form on behalf of your client, like we saw in that counseling session video on campus last week, allow your client to review that information. Make it accessible to them in a different format. Allow them to, see what you've written down on their behalf. So these are all alternative ways to ensure that the client is being provided with similar services if they aren't able to access that information. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys to all the reading. I hope you find the articles useful. I really do. I personally like the larger one, the application of personality theories, because it provides like a nice brief overview of how each of these theories that we've talked about can be applied for use with individuals that have physical disabilities. So with that, I will leave you all to the readings and to the discussion board.